Bright QT. Every student matters.
Hello everyone. So let's move on to our next topic here, that is the Khilafat issue. Now before this students, we have learnt about the idea of Satyagraha and the Satyagraha movements that were launched by Mahatma Gandhi. Now do you remember at what places these Satyagraha movements were launched? So yes, it was in Kheda, then it was in Champaran, and the third one is Ahmedabad, right? So we have talked about all these three places here and how the demands of the peasants were different here, right? In Champaran and in Kheda, and in Ahmedabad, the cotton mill workers, they protested against the government, right? So this was happening in the period that is 1917 to 1918. Meanwhile, there were some other movements that were launched, and now people, they were becoming aware, and this sense of nationalism now was growing among the common people. They saw Gandhiji as their leader, and therefore many things were changing now. Yes, definitely people had different opinions, right? But we see that now there was a mass movement taking place in our country, right? So meanwhile, let us talk about some other changes that was taking place in our country. And one of the changes was the rising of this Khilafat issue. Now, what was this Khilafat issue? Because it was only this that led to the another movement here. And what was that, students? So it was the Khilafat non-cooperation movement. So you must have heard of this term, that is non-cooperation movement. So here we are going to understand how Khilafat was related to this non-cooperation movement and what was this issue all about. So going back to the First World War again. So the First World War, it had ended with the defeat of Ottoman Turkey. Yes, again reminding you of the timeline here, that is 1914 to 1918. And in the First World War, we have already seen it numerous times, right? So the two powers here is the Central Axis power and the Allied power. Now when we are talking about these two powers here, we see that the Ottoman Turkey, it was from the defeating side, the Central Axis powers, right? So Ottoman Turkey was defeated in the First World War. And who was on the Allied side here? So Britain, correct? Now, there were rumors that spread that a harsh peace treaty was going to be imposed on the Ottoman Emperor, who was the spiritual head of the Islamic world. Now students, when you will learn about the Islamic history, you will come across a lot of terms there, right? So here we are going to learn a term that is Khalifa, or he was also known as Caliph. So what happened? These British Indians, when we are talking about the Muslims in the British India, right? So all these people, they had asked the British government to not impose any harsh treaty on the Caliph, who was the spiritual head of the Islamic world. And Ottoman Turkey was also ruled by this Caliph, right? The religious head. So therefore, they wanted that British should not impose any harsh treaty on the Caliph. But there were rumors being spread that a harsh peace treaty was going to be imposed on Ottoman Turkey. Now this upsetted the Muslims who were living in India, that the British government, they were not going according to the promise, right? So as a result of it, Khilafat Committee was formed in Bombay in March 1990. And the whole Khilafat movement, it was started by the Ali brothers. What were their names? Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali. So quite important for you to remember this. While we are talking about the Ottoman Empire, let's have a look at this map here, students. So this region, as you can see, the pink region here, this was the region of Ottoman Empire. But during the First World War, what are we seeing? That this empire was defeated by the Allied powers and Britain was a member in it. And therefore, we are also reading about it when we are talking about the struggle for independence. Like I told you, under the leadership of Ali brothers, that is Shaukat Ali and Muhammad Ali, the committee was formed and the whole Khilafat issue was raised. And that was against the British government who defied their promise. Now, in this committee, who was called? Gandhiji was called, because he was now the leader of masses. So he went on to meet the Ali brothers, and there they both decided that they should fight against the British government. Now during this period, students, Gandhiji saw it as a major point or the turning point, as we can say, for the Indian national movement here. Why? Because he saw it as Hindu-Muslim unity. Now he saw that the Muslims, they were also against the British government, and already Hindus were against the British government. Why? Many other issues had taken place during this period, the famous one being the Jallianwala Bagh incident that took place at Amritsar. So everyone was aroused here and they wanted to fight against the British rule, right? So therefore, he saw this an opportunity to mix Hindus and Muslims together and to fight against the British rule, right? So therefore, what happened? In Calcutta session in 1920, Gandhiji, he went on to convince the Congress leaders to support the Khilafat issue and finally launch the non-cooperation movement. But here we saw that people had difference of opinions here, right? So there were some leaders who wanted this radical action against the British government. They were not able to understand the essence of Satyagraha movement, and therefore they were unwilling to join the Gandhiji's movement here. But eventually what are we seeing? Everyone agreed to it, and that is how the whole Khilafat non-cooperation movement, it started in our country, right? So this was all about the Khilafat issue. And now in the year 1920-21, finally the non-cooperation movement has been launched. Now what is this non-cooperation movement? It was again under the leadership of Gandhiji. Now as the name suggests, what are we seeing? In this non-cooperation movement, people were asked not to cooperate the British government. Quite simple to understand, right? So there were in different ways how this movement unfolded, right? So here we are going to look at that process. At first, Gandhiji, he asked the people to surrender their titles. Then he asked them to boycott the services, the civil services, as in working for the government, also army, courts, legislative councils, schools and foreign goods. So here what are we seeing? Complete boycott of the British government. As in, if anyone is working as a lawyer, if anyone is working in schools, colleges, the students who were going in schools to study, anything that was related to the British government was to be boycotted in whole. So this was the whole non-cooperation movement. Now, if repressive measures were taken, full civil disobedience campaign would be launched. He said that if any repressive measures were be taken by the British government, if the British government tried to repress their Satyagraha movement, then they are going to launch full civil disobedience movement there. So here we see that in this way, in this process, the whole non-cooperation movement was initiated. Here we see that finally the proposals that were not accepted by the Congress, but somehow in 1920 they finally agreed and the non-cooperation movement was unfolded. Correct? So this is how the movement started here. Now let us try to understand the participation of people in the non-cooperation movement. Now definitely students, here we are talking about pan-Indian participation. Why are these movements quite important and why are we reading these movements? Because this shows the struggle against the British rule. Before that, we saw that people were fighting just for their own rights, right? If they saw that their rights were being hampered, so there were some regional protests, some regional movements, tribals, they were fighting for their rights. But here what are we seeing? We see that each and every person, whether it be a rich person, poor person, women, tribals, everyone had their problems. But this time it was a mass movement, pan-India movement and participation from each and every class. Therefore, these movements, it become really important for us to read. So here let us talk about the movements that took place in the towns. Here we see the participation of middle class in large numbers. Thousands of students, they left their government colleges and schools, and teachers and lawyers, they resigned and gave up their jobs. As you can see, people are now participating in the movement. Apart from it, this was Hindu-Muslim unity that was quite visible in this movement, because Muslims also participated in large numbers. Talking about the rebellion that happened in the countryside during the non-cooperation movement. So here we are going to take the case study of Awadh. Now have you heard the term here Awadh? So it was in the United Province region. Let's say the present day region of Uttar Pradesh, right? Along with its adjoining areas. So this was the region of Awadh there. And in Awadh, the peasants, they were led by Baba Ramchandra. Now what are we going to understand through these case studies, students? Here we are going to see the interpretations of the term Swaraj. Swaraj as in independence. Now we will see that how each and every group had their own interpretation of the meaning, that is, of the word that is Swaraj. So the first example we are going to talk about is the peasants that lived in the region Awadh. What did Swaraj mean for them? Right? How did they interpret it and how they were fighting against the unjust rule of British government? So in Awadh, the peasants, they were led by Baba Ramchandra, a renowned figure there. Now he was an indentured laborer who had been to Fiji. Now are you aware of this term indentured? Indentured here, it means forced labor. So basically the laborers, they were forced to go to another place, another destination. For example, when we are talking about Baba Ramchandra, he was an Indian laborer who went to Fiji as an indentured laborer where he had to work under contract. Right? He went to that destination, he had to do this forced labor, the bonded labor that was done under contract for a specific period of time. Okay? So we see that he had been to Fiji as an indentured laborer. Now the movement here was against the talukdars and the landlords who demanded high taxes from the peasants. Now what were they fighting against? Here they were fighting against the talukdars and the landlords, the rich people who had a lot of lands. Now these people, they were demanding high taxes. From whom? From the poor peasants who could not afford it. So definitely the meaning of Swaraj for these poor peasants was to get the freedom from the taxes that were being demanded by the talukdars and the landlords. So Ramchandra, who was a sannyasi, also an indentured labor, was the leader of the movement. Now, campaign was against the atrocities of talukdars and landlords. And landlords, they imposed a variety of taxes and extracted high rents from these peasants. So, you have to remember these 3 points here. When we are talking about the region of Awadh, as you can see in the map, students, the colored part here shows Awadh region, right? Now, what are the problems of these peasants? Forced the peasants, who? These landlords that we are talking about. The rich landlords, they forced the peasants to do begar. Now, what is this begar? The begar here, it means, now it was a forced labor that the peasant had to perform without any payment. Now, they were not being paid for it, and they had to do it forcefully. Now you can imagine the situation of these peasants here, right? So therefore, they were forced to do these begar, and peasants had no right to the land, and they could be thrown out any time by these talukdars and the landlords. Now Gandhiji, when he got to know about the situation, he urged the peasants to pay 50% rent and refused to do begar, the forced labor, and social boycott of these oppressive landlords. Definitely, there were some groups formed, that is of Nais and Dhobis, and some other groups were also formed to boycott these landlords. Correct? Meanwhile, we also see that Jawaharlal Nehru, he came on and he visited these regions of Awadh. And finally, he formed the Awadh Kisan Sabha along with Baba Ramchandra and few other leaders there, right? So there was the Awadh Kisan Sabha that was formed for these peasants who were fighting against the oppressive rule of the landlords and the talukdars. Here we see that with the spread of movement, houses of talukdars and merchants were attacked, bazaars were looted, and grains were hoarded. They were kept stacked in other places, right? Now, rumors were spread that Gandhiji had said no taxes are to be paid. Now, what are we seeing here, students? At first, you learnt about how a Satyagraha movement was launched by Gandhiji in non-cooperation movement, right? But here we are seeing the case study of Awadh and the situation of peasants for whom the non-cooperation movement, it meant to boycott the talukdars and the landlords. Correct? And here we are seeing that how these measures that were taken by the peasants now was turning or taking a violent path. In the year 1921, there were certain sections who were now attacking the houses of merchants and talukdars. All the bazaars were looted. The grains, they were stacked and kept at a place, and also rumors were spread that Gandhiji is saying not to pay any tax. Now this is how the movement started taking turns here, right? And it took an ugly phase in this region when the British government, they tried to repress the movement. Now coming to our exercise section here, we have a question that says, in very short answer question, name the 2 Muslim leaders of Khilafat movement. You can write the names here. The Ali brothers. What were their names? Muhammad Ali and, Shaukat Ali. Right? So you have to write this. Next question is, in multiple choice question, Baba Ramchandra was A sannyasi who was an indentured labor, leader of peasant revolt in Awadh, founder of Kisan Sabha in Awadh in October 1920 along with Jawaharlal Nehru. Last option is all of the above. What do you think? What would be the correct answer? Yes, When we were talking about Baba Ramchand, definitely he was a sannyasi, indentured labor as well. He was again the leader of the peasant movement, we have read just now. He was also the founder, one of the founders of the Kisan Sabha, Awadh, right? Awadh Kisan Sabha. So answer here would be D, all of the above.